Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's Ag Forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions, your premier platform for real-time global insights. Well, over the weekend, there was some great discussion about the frequency of rainfall events across the United States. So I made a map that shows you the number of days where we've recorded precipitation greater than 1/10 of an inch since the beginning of the new year. And the first region I want to circle for you here has on average seen about 1 in every 4 days showing up with precipitation. And right in through here, it's been even higher than that. We've seen some locations in through here that it's been as high as 1 in every 3 days. Meanwhile, the North Central Plains, after a very snowy start to the winter back in October, November, December, has backed off. We've seen some precipitation come through, but overall, not the major snowfall events that we had been seeing earlier on in the season. But I imagine much of your attention is drawn out west, where if I just kind of draw a dividing line north-south here, we can see that, well, parts of the Pacific Northwest, some locations there in the Cascades and the Northern Rockies have had 40 out of the last 45 days showing up with measurable precipitation, while parts of California have seen, well, less than 5 days. In some locations, we've not measured any precipitation over the last 45 days. And that's been because of a large high-pressure cell sitting in this area, directing systems around the northern edge of this. Now, with that as a backdrop, let me show you what's been going on with snowpack out west. Take you to the end of 2019. At that time period, the Sierra Nevada reporting stations, well, between 120 and 160%, while parts of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana were seeing their basin average snow water content sit between about 20 and 60%. Well, since then, things have changed quite a bit. So this was the end of 2019, and this is now through February 16, 2020. The major differences, look at the numbers as they have rebounded here in parts of the Pacific Northwest, now reporting between 80 and 120%, while those Sierra Nevada reporting stations are now between 50 and 70%. This has been a product of the split flow that we've seen south in the Gulf of Alaska, and the big question we have to answer is, do I see any changes happening, well, between California and Alaska as being the major setup for our pattern as we enter the month of March, because it'll be critical not only for the western United States, but also for the east. We've seen drought now emerge here in parts of California, but rest of the country here has not seen too much of a change overall in the drought monitor with the latest release at the end of last week. Now, speaking of the heaviest of regions in terms of precipitation, if you look right over here, on average, we've seen about 8 inches of rainfall. The spread goes from about 4 inches, and then some locations in through here, greater than 15 inches of rain. So this is why we're asking ourselves, is this pattern going to change? Because we've seen extremes from west to east across the country in terms of precipitation. Now, over the weekend, a relatively quieter weekend for much of the United States. Some snow here in the Pacific Northwest with some valley rain. And then a lot of the attention was down in the southeast over the weekend just because of the running of the Daytona 500. Right in through here where we had some pretty nasty storm cells that kind of moved through, producing some locally very heavy rainfall, shutting the race down, which is why we're going to run it again today on Monday. But this is kind of the bigger story that we need to get back to. For the beginning of this year, so from the 1st of this year all the way through Friday, this is what our upper level pattern's done. It's featured a ridge sitting here south of the Aleutian Islands and broad troughing that's extended from Alaska through British Columbia. What that's done is that sent our jet stream to do something like this. Now, what's prevented it from further digging into the U.S., keeping things cold, is the broader ridge you see sitting here. So the jet stream needs to run around that and then curl just to the south of the very anomalously low pressure that we've been seeing here in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere over Greenland. So it's been a tale of 2 ridges and 2 troughs. Those are the 2 ridges with H's, and I'll put X's inside of our troughs. That would be the pattern that would need to change in order for us to see a major change in our precipitation behavior, okay? What this has done at the surface is it's created high pressure here. It's had low pressure systems that have swung through in this area, but the lowest of the pressure has been tucked away over the Arctic and sitting from Greenland toward Iceland and over toward much of northern Europe. When I go back and research and study the winter of 2019-2020, I'm going to remember it for a few things. 1, that split flow pattern that's come around the west coast. 2, the much above average Arctic oscillation that's seen in these very low pressures sitting in this area. And 3, the North Atlantic oscillation being so high as well. That's what's given us that deeper trough that set over Greenland throughout much of this winter. Where the models have struggled most is with Alaska, and that's going to be a theme throughout the rest of this video. Now, with that deep low pressure sitting over Greenland, it has produced some epically strong low pressure systems. This is the one that we saw emerge over the weekend just south of Iceland. The central pressure inside of this is the equivalent of some of our strongest hurricanes, although this is not a hurricane, and it has produced incredibly windy conditions across much of northern Europe. So this has been what that pattern has got us into. All right, we have been able to unlock some of that cold air at times. For example, over the last 7 days, we've had a pretty good cold air intrusion that's moved through the central part of the United States over toward parts of the east. But when we just look back over the last 45 days, it's been Alaska and Greenland have hung on to much of the colder air. And even these near-term cold air intrusions that have come through have not been able to undo the warm bias that we have seen across the eastern two-thirds of the United States. So will that continue? Well, we're going to stay on a similar trajectory as we saw last week. What I mean by that is these rapidly fluctuating temperatures. Any colder that comes through is relatively brief. So you're looking here at a series of maps starting on Monday that show you departure from normal temperatures. So we can see that the next shot at colder air is coming in here into parts of the Intermountain West and the North Central Plains. As I play it on into Tuesday here, cold air advances. There's a low pressure system that's moving through, so this is the cold air behind it. High pressure coming into parts of the North Central Plains, and that really gets established by Wednesday. So this midweek cool down, 10 to 20 degrees below average here, but watch. From there to Thursday, slides east. By Friday, slides south. Saturday, the warmth returns on a ridge in the midsection of the country, such that by Sunday we've now moved back over to warmer conditions again. So this roller coaster ride of temperatures seems to be continuing. Now, probably the most important animation I'm going to show you today is this one right here. This looks at the upper level flow pattern, and I want you to watch very carefully 3 regions. One is Alaska, 2 is Hawaii, and the third is the region south of Greenland. So as we play this forward, let's pause it right here. This is the main trough that is sweeping through, bringing in the relatively weak low pressure system that's going to be moving through the Midwest toward the Great Lakes states. I say relatively weak because this is a very broad trough with no real well-defined features to give us good upper level support for the rapid deepening of a low pressure system. You'll see what I mean in a moment. But as we go on forward with time, that trough slowly sweeps through. This is why we have a cool middle and end of the week. But look at the ridge that pumps in behind this thing. Right there toward the end of the week. That's what brings the warm-up for next weekend. Now, we do have, by the time we get into Friday, a little cutoff low coming through parts of California. And yes, this will be bringing in some precipitation. But now we start watching the areas I want you to watch. Alaska to California and over here toward Greenland. So beginning this weekend, we're starting to notice that the trough that's been established here over Alaska, by the time we get into early next week, we'll let that cold air, see it coming through this trough here, let it slide down into the Intermountain West, setting up shop here over, well, Colorado. And it does this by next Tuesday. This will give us very unsettled weather in parts of the Midwest and the Central Plains, moving over toward the Great Lakes states, middle of the week next week. And if that trough moves on through, this is going to give us another shot at some cooler weather to finish out the month of February. Now remember, it was Alaska, California, and Greenland. You see, by the time we get toward the end of the month, here's the big change. This ridge seems to be pushing into Alaska. The flow wants to go over to what we call high over low. And if this trough does become established, that is a good change for California, suggesting we could be getting, well, more wet weather into California with time. But with the trough really setting up shop here over the eastern part of the United States, this pattern is one that is going to be much cooler for the, well, much of the lower 48. And it looks as though we're going to start off March with that being the pattern. So it's this high over low here, joining up with the trough that's south of Greenland that could get the eastern, well, much of the United States here over toward a cooler pattern. So let's see if that really evolves. Next 5 days, remember, the ridge builds back in. Day 5 through 10, the ridge builds back in, and that's why the warm-up happens here while the colder air lingers in this area. That means storehouse cold, though, sitting over Alaska. You then see day 10 through 15 with the ridge pushing into this area. Look at the cooler air that comes here into this section of the United States. Now, I'm telling you to be cautious about this because the only changes that we're seeing here are in, I think, really in the North Pacific and over Alaska. And we have seen the models really struggle with what we call the East Pacific oscillation, which is what I'm describing to you here. We've seen them struggle getting this right. So with other things not unfolding, what I mean by that is the polar vortex isn't split. I'm not seeing any major shift in the tropics. It's going to be a tricky forecast as we move forward out into the beginning of March. But as we finish up the month of February, not much of a change overall. So remember, that change I'm talking about is at the beginning of March. So we continue on with the drier conditions, especially in California. Remember, with that trough that does dip down early next week here into the Intermountain West and then pulls into this area. That's why we see the wetter average conditions in here. We just keep leaving stalled frontal boundaries over the southeast, keeping things quite wet in that area. So, in the near term, what are we dealing with? Well, winter weather advisory is out for parts of Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We'll take a look at that. Patchy fog elsewhere around the country. And we do still have our problems here with some strong winds blowing around some of the snow here in parts of Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. So just looking at snowfall through the middle of this week, so this is the Wednesday evening, we will be seeing here in parts of Colorado, getting out into the Front Range. A couple of inches of snow here could make for some tough travel. Coming right into parts of Nebraska, we're seeing a similar thing midweek, and this is all coming in on the leading edge of a big cold front toward the middle of this week. But if you come over here to the Great Lakes states from parts of Iowa getting into Wisconsin and Michigan, this will be a 2 to 5 inch snowfall event in the area that you saw me circle there. But to the south of there, more very heavy rainfall is anticipated from eastern and central Texas all the way over to the Carolina coast, where we could pick up another 3/4 of an inch to over 2 inches of rainfall through the end of this week. So this is just your next 5 days. As you move north of there, this will mostly be rain with snow on the northern side of it. And you can see that things are kind of calming down a little bit over the next 5 days for much of the western part of the United States, where we have been extremely wet in this area. So let's see it all in action here by going over to our European model. Pressing play, there's our first system this week. So on that really ill-defined trough that sweeps through, this is not a deep low pressure system. And as it sweeps through, the rain-snow boundary, like we talked about last week, was really cutting right in through this area. So this will be a colder rain in through here with the heavier snows on the northern side of this. Behind it, high pressure pulls in very quickly. So light snow out ahead of that on the kind of the cold front that comes in. And I want you to notice something. As I get out here to Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, with the low pressure center sitting here, a high pressure cell sitting in this area, and a high pressure cell sitting here, we have reason to stall out a bit of a boundary right in this area for about 24 hours. This is what's giving us some wetter than average conditions here on Tuesday getting into Wednesday. So you'll watch as I play forward into Wednesday morning, afternoon, and evening. That will be the area on which we're seeing the heavier precipitation on that stalled boundary. High pressure then takes over for the middle and end of our week with some lighter snow spreading from Colorado into parts of Nebraska and Kansas. As we play this forward, you'll see that high pressure cell pushes again on the warmer, moist air that is sitting here over the Gulf. And that's why we get again toward the end of the week, Thursday into Friday, more wet weather stretching in here into parts of the south. Getting into the weekend, we see this is now Friday morning, Friday afternoon, and evening. High pressure dominates the midsection of the country here, but it slides east. And that's why we saw by the time we got into Sunday the rebounding of the warmer conditions and our next system starting to emerge here. Now, much of the Northwest saw a quieter week until we get here into Sunday when our next big system comes pushing through, bringing in again more snow in the mountains and some valley rain. And I'll just let this play out through part of the weekend here. Sunday into Monday, we're watching another system slide through parts of the Mid-South, soaking this area again. Now I'm going to stop it here because I don't think the operational model is going to have this right. But this is where the deeper trough next week slides in here. Remember, it came out of Alaska and set up right through there. And this could produce very unsettled conditions in the midsection of the United States right in through here into week 2. That's why I'll just show you it like this. With that trough becoming established here, watch this area into next week for having the potential for a pretty sizable low pressure system. And we're still seeing the wetter than average conditions in through this area due to those lingering frontal boundaries that sit there. After this, that's when the pattern might change for the west coast of the United States. So what could be sparking this change? Well, we've been noticing that throughout much of the new year, a major driver on the frequency of our weather systems has been global angular momentum. So it's really shot up here like this, and then has faded here over the last week and a half or so, back down toward normal. It's forecast to kind of, hover around normal and then rebound a little bit, which means we're not going to be doing anything, I think, to slow down our weather systems into the month of March. But where's this cold air coming from? We're not getting much support out of the tropics, first of all, with the Mount-Julian oscillation sitting over here in phase 5 or 6 and projected to go back maybe into null phase for a while before emerging maybe over here in phase 8, 1, and 2. But it's not doing so at very high amplitude, so it's not as though the tropics are helping out with this colder pattern. And certainly it's not the stratosphere. The polar vortex through the next 10 days expected to stay quite strong, sitting right over the Arctic, so not much of a change in that. So that's where I come back to the first maps I showed you. You see, up until this point in the year, the high pressure cell, the big ridge in the upper levels of the atmosphere, has been sitting here. We notice that over the next 10 to 15 days, that high pressure cell begins to move in this direction. So I'm talking here about the upper level ridge. And that allows the trough that was in British Columbia to become established over in this area. And that's why we end up getting this pattern that does something like that. Now, wet Marches in California have troughs that start here in the Bering Sea and then stretch back into this area. So we would need to see that pattern evolving for California to really have a major rebound in precipitation. But as we discussed in last week's technical outlook, we knew that this pattern was more conducive to letting more colder air set up across the eastern half of North America. And I think we're going to be seeing that as we move into the month of March. But again, it's really this change right here that everything is dependent on. So we got to watch it very carefully as we move out of February and into March. To finish this up, take a quick trip down to South America. Let's watch the animation on the right first. This was yesterday, looking at sunup to sundown, and we saw some very powerful thunderstorms that erupted here over parts of Argentina's most productive region. And the video you've been looking at over there on the left, that's in Cordoba, and that is showing one of the supercells that blew up down here in South America, producing a tornado. These storms then went over to parts of Uruguay, producing some very heavy rainfall and localized flooding overnight. But overall, when we just look out over the next 10 days, I want to show you the precipitation patterns throughout much of Brazil's northern and eastern growing regions showing up wetter than average. Even though we've seen this off and on throughout much of the harvest of soybeans, they've made some pretty good progress in Mato Grosso. They've got 40% of those beans harvested, and right now they're about 4% above average on the planting of the safrinha crop. So these rains really have not, on a large scale, slowed things down in Brazil's growing regions. Southern Brazil has been dry, and they're showing up dry again. And Argentina, the very heavy rainfall as of late, means that the forecast we've seen here over the next 10 days isn't necessarily that significant given the rainfall we just saw. All right. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this forecast video. Hope that you'll have a great start to this week, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Thank you.